The little girl started crying before the billionaire even finished the sentence. The sound came out small at first, barely louder than the ticking grandfather clock near the marble staircase. But inside that giant Connecticut mansion, it sounded like something breaking apart forever. A white porcelain cereal bowl slipped from 6-year-old Sophie's trembling hands and shattered across the kitchen floor, while milk spread between the marble tiles like a crack running through the center of the family itself. Upstairs, a door slammed so hard the chandelier above the foyer shook. Then came the voice, loud, sharp, angry enough to make both daughters freeze where they stood. 11-year-old Claire instinctively reached for her younger sister's hand beneath the breakfast table because she recognized that tone. It was the same voice their father used after their mother's funeral, the same voice that appeared whenever grief turned into rage. And standing quietly near the kitchen counter, still wearing her pale blue nanny uniform with flour on one sleeve from the pancakes she had been making only minutes earlier, was the woman both girls secretly loved more than anyone else left inside that mansion. Her name was Emily Carter, and in less than 10 minutes, billionaire businessman Richard Belmont was about to force her out of their lives forever. Nobody looking at the Belmont estate from the outside would have guessed the family inside was collapsing. To the rest of America, Richard Belmont represented the kind of success magazines loved printing on glossy covers: private jets, investment empires, luxury resorts, the perfect widowed father rebuilding his life after tragedy. Financial television hosts called him disciplined. Newspapers called him brilliant. But grief has a way of hiding inside expensive homes. Behind the polished windows and carefully rehearsed smiles, Richard Belmont had become a man running almost entirely on exhaustion, anger, and guilt. Since losing his wife Caroline 3 years earlier to a sudden illness, he buried himself inside work while the mansion slowly transformed into something cold and emotionally hollow. His daughters stopped laughing loudly. Entire rooms went untouched for weeks. Dinner conversations became shorter every month. And somehow, without anyone fully noticing when it happened, Emily became the one person holding the emotional pieces together. She packed lunches, calmed nightmares, helped with homework, sat through tears no one else saw, and memorized every detail about the girls, fears, and routines. She was never supposed to become family, but sometimes the people who save us arrive quietly, carrying grocery bags and bedtime stories instead of grand speeches. Richard never understood how much his daughters depended on her until the morning he decided to fire her. And the terrifying part was this: at the time, he truly believed he was doing the right thing. The previous night had already pushed him close to the edge. A business partner he trusted for almost 15 years had betrayed him publicly during a corporate merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Financial news stations spent all night speculating about lawsuits and internal scandals, while Richard sat alone in his office drinking coffee that had long gone cold. By sunrise, he hadn't slept at all. Then came the misunderstanding that changed everything. Halfway down the staircase, Richard overheard Emily speaking softly with Claire inside the kitchen. Claire had been asking questions about trust funds and inheritance after overhearing reporters discussing the Belmont fortune on television. Emily calmly explained that money could never replace parents who truly listen to their children, but exhausted minds often hear what they fear most. Richard didn't hear comfort. He heard manipulation. By the time he entered the kitchen, fury had already taken control of him. Sophie backed away the moment her father's voice thundered across the room. Claire immediately stepped in front of her younger sister, while Emily remained completely still beside the counter, almost like she already understood where this was heading. Richard accused her of filling his daughters' heads with ideas about money, poisoning them against him, making them emotionally dependent on her. The accusations came fast, cruel, and louder with every sentence. Emily tried speaking twice before stopping herself. Maybe because she realized grief was talking louder than reason. Maybe because people who spend years caring for broken families often learn silence before self-defense. But when Richard finally pointed toward the front door and told her to pack her things immediately, Sophie let out a cry so heartbreaking even the housekeeper later admitted she could still hear it in her dreams weeks afterward. Claire's reaction was even worse. She didn't cry at first. She stared directly at her father with a look no child should ever wear, cold disappointment, the kind that arrives when love collides with betrayal. And then she said 6 words that Richard Belmont would replay in his head for the rest of his life. If she leaves, we leave too. For a moment, nobody moved. Even Richard looked shaken by the sentence hanging in the air between them. Sophie clung tightly to Emily's waist, sobbing into her uniform while Emily gently stroked the little girl's hair, trying to calm her even as her own eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Claire stood frozen beside the kitchen island, arms crossed tightly over herself like she was trying to physically hold her heart together. Richard opened his mouth twice before speaking again, but the anger had already gone too far to reverse itself easily. Pride is dangerous that way, especially inside powerful men who mistake emotional control for strength. Instead of softening, Richard doubled down. He told the girls they were children and didn't understand what was happening. He insisted Emily had crossed boundaries. He said the family needed distance, but neither daughter reacted the way he expected. Sophie cried harder. Claire simply looked away from him entirely, and that was the moment the mansion changed. Years later, Richard would admit that losing Emily wasn't actually the beginning of the disaster. The real beginning happened the instant his oldest daughter stopped looking at him like a father. Emily packed quietly. That was the part several staff members later remembered most clearly. No yelling, no begging, no dramatic speeches, just silence. She folded clothes carefully into an old suitcase while Sophie sat crying on the edge of the guest room bed, and Claire stood near the doorway refusing to leave her side. Downstairs, the mansion felt emotionally frozen. Richard paced his office pretending to answer business calls while barely hearing anything his assistant said. Outside, heavy gray clouds rolled slowly across the sky above the Belmont estate, turning the enormous property dim and cold despite it being only late morning. When Emily finally stepped through the front doors carrying her suitcase, Sophie broke free from Claire's grip and ran barefoot across the stone driveway after her. The image would later become impossible for Richard to forget. His youngest daughter crying uncontrollably, tiny feet slapping against cold pavement, begging the nanny not to leave while security gates slowly opened behind them. Emily knelt down immediately and held her tightly, whispering promises that everything would somehow be okay. But even then, her face carried the expression of someone who already knew the damage had gone much deeper than one terrible argument. What happened after Richard Belmont fired the nanny shocked even the people closest to him. Because within 48 hours, the silence inside that mansion became unbearable. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the second night without Eva Reyes inside the Belmont mansion, the silence had started affecting everyone differently. 6-year-old Emma refused to sleep in her own bedroom unless one of the housekeepers left the hallway light on exactly the way Eva used to. 11-year-old Lily stopped speaking during dinner entirely. And Richard Belmont, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking once under pressure, suddenly found himself unable to sit through a single meal with his daughters without feeling like a stranger trapped inside his own home. What frightened him most was not the crying. It was the distance, the emotional withdrawal, the way Lily looked through him instead of at him. In public, Richard still appeared composed. Financial interviews continued. Meetings continued. His company's stock even recovered slightly after the scandal that had triggered his outburst. But privately, the structure of his life was beginning to crack in ways he didn't yet fully understand. Because what Richard believed was a simple firing was, in reality, the removal of the emotional foundation holding his daughters together after their mother's death. And the terrifying part was that he still didn't know it. To the outside world, Richard Belmont looked like the kind of American success story people admired from a distance. At 47 years old, he owned luxury hotels across 3 states, appeared regularly on business magazines, and carried himself with the disciplined confidence of someone who had spent decades building an empire from almost nothing. Employees respected him because he demanded excellence. Investors trusted him because he rarely lost control publicly. But grief changes people in quiet ways first. After Caroline Belmont died, Richard became obsessed with structure, schedules, order, and control because control was the only thing grief could not completely destroy. The mansion became spotless. Staff became carefully managed. Emotions became inconvenient interruptions. Somewhere along the way, Richard convinced himself that providing financially meant he was still being a good father. But children do not measure love through expensive schools or marble kitchens. They measure it through presence, through listening, through emotional safety. And without realizing it, Richard had slowly outsourced almost all of that to Eva Reyes. Eva never entered the Belmont family intending to become emotionally important. At 34 years old, she was originally hired through a private domestic staffing agency shortly after Caroline's death. Her job description sounded simple on paper: assist with childcare, manage routines, help stabilize the household during a period of grief. But from the very beginning, Eva understood something nobody else inside that mansion seemed willing to admit openly. The girls were not simply grieving their mother. They were losing their father too. Richard buried himself inside work so completely that entire weeks passed where Eva spent more waking hours with Lily and Emma than he did. She learned which nightmares woke Emma at 3 in the morning. She learned Lily pretended not to cry because she believed protecting her younger sister was now her responsibility. She learned how to navigate the silence hanging over the mansion without forcing the girls to move on before they were emotionally ready. Slowly, almost invisibly, she became the emotional center of the household, not because she tried to replace their mother, but because she stayed present when everyone else emotionally disappeared. And that was exactly why the girls reacted the way they did when Richard fired her. To him, Eva was an employee who had crossed boundaries. To Lily and Emma, she was the person who held their lives together after tragedy ripped through their family. Lily especially understood far more than adults around her realized. At 11 years old, she had already developed the exhausting emotional maturity grief often forces onto children too early. She noticed every missed recital, every distracted conversation, every business call her father prioritized over family dinners. She also noticed how hard Eva worked to protect Emma from feeling abandoned. Over time, Lily's gratitude toward Eva quietly transformed into loyalty, fierce loyalty, the kind children develop toward people who consistently show up for them emotionally. So when Richard stood inside that kitchen and accused Eva of manipulation, Lily didn't hear discipline. She heard betrayal. Emma's reaction came from somewhere even deeper. At only 6 years old, she still associated safety with routines, bedtime stories, pancakes on Sunday mornings, Eva's voice outside her bedroom after nightmares. Losing Eva felt terrifying because, in Emma's mind, people she loved kept disappearing. But there was another reason the girls panicked so intensely that morning. A reason Richard still knew nothing about. Hidden beneath the polished routines of the Belmont household was a private emotional arrangement that had quietly existed for nearly 2 years. One that connected Eva, Lily, and Emma far more deeply than Richard could have imagined. Even now, years later, people close to the family still argue over whether Eva should have told him sooner. Because while Richard Belmont spent his days protecting the financial future of his daughters, Eva had secretly been protecting something much harder to repair: their emotional survival. The truth was buried inside handwritten journals, late-night therapy appointments, quiet conversations after nightmares, and promises made between grieving children who were terrified of losing another person they loved. And the most heartbreaking part of all was this: Richard never noticed any of it happening directly in front of him. 3 days after Eva left the mansion, Lily stopped answering her father entirely. Not rudely, not dramatically. She simply withdrew. If Richard asked how school was, she shrugged. If he tried discussing homework, she nodded without eye contact. Emma became worse at hiding her emotions. Staff members overheard her crying at night asking when Eva was coming home. One housekeeper later admitted she found Emma asleep in Eva's old room curled beside one of her abandoned sweaters because it still smelled familiar. Richard attempted to restore normalcy the only way he knew how. More gifts, more outings, more expensive distractions. But grief and emotional abandonment do not disappear because someone buys concert tickets or new toys. The mansion only grew colder. At night, Richard began hearing echoes of small routines that no longer existed. No piano music drifting from the family room, no laughter during breakfast, no calm voice reminding the girls to finish homework before dessert. The house still looked beautiful from the outside, but emotionally it already felt abandoned. Then came the moment that truly unsettled him. 4 nights after firing Eva, Richard passed Lily's bedroom around midnight and heard Emma whispering through tears from inside. "Do you think she misses us too?" There was a long silence before Lily answered softly, "I think she's the only person who ever stayed." Richard froze outside the door, because for the first time since Caroline's death, he was forced to confront a possibility too painful to ignore. His daughters no longer trusted him emotionally. And deep down, he began realizing that maybe Eva Reyes had never been the problem at all. Maybe she had been the only reason the family hadn't completely fallen apart already. But by then, the damage had already spread too far. Because at the time, nobody knew the girls had already made a decision that would change Richard Belmont's life forever. Long before the screaming started in the kitchen that morning, the Belmont mansion had already become a place built on routines pretending to be healing. From the outside, the estate looked almost unreal. 14,000 square feet of polished stone, towering windows, private gardens, and long, quiet hallways lined with photographs from a life that no longer existed the way it once had. Every morning at exactly 6:30, the kitchen lights came on before sunrise because Eva Reyes believed children carried grief more safely when life remained predictable. She would start coffee for Richard first, always black, no sugar, placed near the end of the marble counter before he came downstairs checking emails on his phone. Then came pancakes for Emma, fruit carefully arranged for Lily because Lily stopped eating properly after her mother died, and soft music playing low enough to make the giant house feel less empty. It looked peaceful to anyone walking through the room, but grief has strange ways of surviving inside beautiful places. Sometimes it hides inside silence. Sometimes inside routines people repeat because they are afraid of what happens when they stop. Richard Belmont rarely noticed the details anymore. Most mornings, he appeared downstairs already distracted by conference calls, financial reports, and market updates flashing across the screen of his phone before breakfast had even started. He kissed Emma on the head automatically, nodded toward Lily, drank half his coffee, and disappeared into his home office before the girls finished eating. At first, after Caroline died, he told himself the extra work was temporary. He believed providing stability financially was the best way to protect his daughters after tragedy. But months slowly turned into years, and the distance inside the family became normal without anyone fully admitting it aloud. Lily noticed first. Children always notice first. She noticed how her father no longer laughed during conversations. She noticed he avoided entering her mother's old art room entirely. She noticed every family discussion somehow ended with him checking his phone or apologizing for another urgent meeting. The hardest part was that Richard truly believed he was trying. From his perspective, he was holding the family together the only way he knew how. But emotionally, he was disappearing room by room from his daughters' lives. Eva saw all of it quietly. She never criticized Richard directly in front of the girls because she understood something many people around wealthy families often ignore. Grief makes people emotionally uneven. Some cry openly. Others bury themselves inside work until exhaustion replaces feeling altogether. Richard belonged to the second category. Still, Someone had to occupy the emotional space he left behind. Over time, that person became Eva. She remembered school projects. She remembered which stuffed animal Emma needed nearby before sleeping. She sat with Lily during panic attacks the girl tried hiding from everyone else. She learned how to answer difficult questions about death without making children feel guilty for still hurting years later. Most importantly, she became the bridge between the girls and their father whenever emotional conversations became too painful to navigate directly. If Lily felt angry at Richard, she told Eva first. If Emma missed her mother, she climbed into Eva's lap without speaking at all. None of it happened dramatically. There was no single moment where Eva suddenly became emotionally essential. It happened gradually, quietly, like sunlight slowly filling a room people forgot had been dark for too long. At night, the mansion changed completely. During daytime hours, assistants, housekeepers, landscapers, and business calls created enough movement to distract from the loneliness hanging over the estate. But after sunset, the silence returned. Emma hated bedtime most. That was when she missed Caroline the hardest. For nearly 2 years after her mother's death, she refused to sleep alone unless Eva sat beside her bed until she drifted off. Sometimes Eva read stories. Sometimes they simply talked quietly about school or clouds or memories Emma was afraid of forgetting. On difficult nights, Emma slept holding one of Eva's scarves because she said it smelled safe. Lily pretended to be older and stronger than she really was, but Eva often found her sitting alone in the upstairs hallway late at night staring at family photographs from before the funeral changed everything. One evening, Lily asked a question that stayed with Eva for months afterward. Do you think people can still love you and slowly disappear at the same time? She was talking about her father. Even at 11 years old, she already understood emotional absence in ways most adults spend entire lifetimes trying to explain. Richard avoided discussing Caroline almost entirely. Her clothes remained untouched in parts of the master closet. Her piano sat closed in the music room gathering dust no one mentioned aloud. Family photographs still decorated the walls, but conversations about her felt strangely forbidden inside the mansion. The girls learned quickly that mentioning their mother usually caused Richard to emotionally shut down for the rest of the evening. Eva handled those conversations instead. She answered questions about Caroline's favorite songs. She listened when Emma admitted she was scared of forgetting her mother's voice someday. She helped Lily write letters addressed to someone who would never answer back. In many ways, Eva became less like an employee and more like emotional oxygen inside the Belmont household. She translated grief into something survivable for the girls. She translated the girls' emotions into forms their father might eventually understand. And somewhere deep inside himself, Richard knew this even if he never fully acknowledged it directly. That was part of what made the firing so tragic later. He was not removing a nanny from the house. He was removing the emotional structure his daughters had built their lives around after loss shattered their family. There were small warning signs before everything collapsed. Lily had started watching her father differently during dinner, almost studying him carefully the way children do when they begin emotionally preparing themselves for disappointment. Emma became clingier whenever Richard raised his voice, even during harmless phone calls unrelated to the family. Eva noticed both changes immediately. She also noticed Richard sleeping less, snapping at staff more often, and isolating himself deeper inside work pressures nobody around him fully understood. Financial articles praised him publicly during that period for expanding his company aggressively after Caroline's death, calling him resilient and disciplined. But resilience and emotional health are not always the same thing. Late at night, Richard sometimes sat alone in his office staring at old photographs on his desk, while whiskey melted slowly against untouched ice cubes beside him. Once, Eva walked past the room after calming Emma from another nightmare, and overheard him quietly listening to one of Caroline's old voicemail recordings over and over without speaking a single word. In those moments, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man drowning privately inside a life everyone else envied. The saddest part was that the family still had moments that almost looked normal. Sunday movie nights, Christmas decorating, Emma laughing during baking disasters in the kitchen, Lily occasionally smiling during board games when she forgot to guard herself emotionally for a few minutes. Eva protected those moments carefully because she understood how fragile they really were. She understood the mansion was functioning almost entirely on emotional routines held together by exhaustion, grief, and denial. One serious disruption could break everything apart, and eventually that disruption arrived. Not through some dramatic scandal at first, not through betrayal inside the family. It started with a single phone call Richard received late one Thursday evening while the girls were upstairs finishing homework with Eva at the dining room table. The moment he answered, something changed in his face immediately. His expression hardened, his voice lowered. And by the next morning, the emotional atmosphere inside the Belmont mansion felt completely different. Because somewhere beyond the walls of that beautiful estate, pressure had started building that Richard Belmont was no longer emotionally strong enough to carry without hurting the people closest to him. And then one phone call changed the atmosphere inside the mansion overnight. The phone call came at 9:47 on a Thursday night while rain pressed softly against the tall windows of Richard Belmont's office. Downstairs, Eva Reyes was helping Emma glue pieces of colored paper together for a school project, while Lily worked quietly beside them at the dining table, pretending not to notice how often she checked the staircase waiting for her father to come downstairs. Upstairs, Richard had been reviewing contracts for nearly 3 hours when his private line rang. At first, the conversation sounded controlled. Calm questions, long pauses, short answers, but within minutes the tone shifted completely. One of his oldest business partners had turned against him during a major acquisition deal involving several luxury properties in Florida. Internal documents had been leaked to financial reporters. Investors were panicking. News outlets were already preparing stories questioning whether Richard's company had hidden major losses from shareholders. The timing could not have been worse. Over the previous year, Richard had expanded aggressively, borrowing enormous amounts of money to keep the Belmont brand growing after Caroline's death, because work was the only thing distracting him from grief. Now, for the first time in years, he realized everything he built could begin collapsing publicly. People later described Richard differently depending on how well they knew him. Business rivals called him ruthless. Employees called him demanding. Magazine profiles called him brilliant under pressure. But inside that office that night sat something much more fragile than the image he projected publicly. He was exhausted, emotionally depleted, running almost entirely on caffeine, grief, and stubborn determination. After the call ended, Richard remained motionless behind his desk staring at the city lights beyond the mansion windows while his breathing slowly changed. The betrayal hurt him more deeply because the partner involved had once been close to Caroline too. Richard kept replaying the same thoughts repeatedly. How long had this been happening behind his back? Who else already knew? What would happen if reporters started investigating his finances more aggressively? What would happen to the girls if the company failed publicly? Fear mixed with exhaustion until both emotions became nearly impossible to separate. By midnight, he was packing the office alone with his tie loosened and shirt sleeves rolled unevenly past his wrists. At one point, he opened an old voicemail from Caroline without realizing he had done it. Her voice filled the room softly for a few seconds before he shut it off again almost immediately, like the sound physically hurt him. The next morning, everyone inside the Belmont mansion noticed the atmosphere had changed before Richard even spoke. Staff moved more carefully. Conversations stayed quieter. The house itself seemed tense somehow, as though even the walls sensed pressure building. Richard came downstairs later than usual carrying his phone in one hand while scrolling through financial headlines already discussing rumors surrounding his company. He barely touched breakfast. Emma tried showing him the paper butterfly she made the night before, but he only nodded distractedly before walking toward the kitchen window to answer another call. Lily watched him carefully from across the table while Eva silently continued pouring orange juice into glasses, pretending not to notice the emotional storm moving through the room. She recognized the signs immediately. Richard's silence had become sharper, more dangerous. It was the kind of silence people carry right before they lose control emotionally. Throughout the morning, his frustration kept leaking into small moments. He snapped at an assistant over scheduling, corrected a housekeeper too harshly over misplaced documents, ignored two separate calls from his brother entirely. Every hour seemed to tighten something inside him further. By early afternoon, the financial pressure had worsened. One of the company's lenders threatened to pull support unless Richard addressed the growing scandal publicly. News trucks had already started appearing outside one of his Manhattan offices. Several board members demanded emergency meetings. Inside the mansion, Richard locked himself inside the study for nearly 2 hours while the girls stayed upstairs with Eva. It should have been an ordinary moment. Emma coloring quietly, Lily doing homework at the dining room table, Eva trying to keep the house emotionally steady while tension drifted through every hallway. But grief and stress distort perception. Around 4 o'clock, Lily asked a question she had apparently been holding inside for weeks. What happens to us if Dad loses everything? Eva looked surprised at first before setting down the dish towel in her hands. She calmly explained that children should never carry adult fears alone. Lily pressed further. She mentioned hearing reporters discuss the Belmont fortune on television. She asked whether the mansion would disappear too. Eva knelt slightly beside her chair and said something simple, something meant entirely to comfort. Money can change a lot of things, she told her gently, but it should never decide whether people feel loved or protected. Unfortunately, Richard overheard only part of the conversation. He had stepped out of the study moments earlier after another brutal phone call from investors and paused near the hallway leading into the kitchen just as Lily quietly asked, "Do you think Dad even notices how unhappy we are anymore?" Eva hesitated before answering carefully. "Your father loves both of you very much," she said softly. "He's just hurting in ways he doesn't know how to explain." But Richard barely processed that part. Exhausted minds hear fear differently. In his emotional state, fragmented sentences became accusations. Comfort became manipulation. By the time he entered the kitchen, paranoia had already fused itself to his exhaustion. His footsteps echoed hard against the marble floors as all three turned toward him instantly. Lily's expression tightened. Emma lowered her crayon slowly. Eva straightened carefully, sensing danger almost immediately. Richard's face looked pale beneath the overhead lights, like he hadn't slept properly in days. For several seconds nobody spoke. The silence itself felt frightening. Then Richard asked the question that changed everything. "What exactly have you been telling my daughters about money?" His voice remained controlled at first, but only barely. Eva looked genuinely confused. She calmly explained the conversation, but Richard interrupted before she could finish. He accused her of overstepping boundaries, of inserting herself too deeply into private family matters. The tension escalated fast because underneath the accusation sat something far more painful: fear. Fear that he was losing control of his business, fear that he was failing his daughters, fear that someone else had quietly become more emotionally important to them than he was. Eva tried speaking again, keeping her voice steady despite the girls now watching in growing panic. "Richard," she said carefully, "they're scared. They need reassurance." But the moment she used his first name instead of Mr. Belmont, something inside him snapped completely. "Don't tell me what my daughters need," he shouted suddenly, loud enough that Emma physically flinched in her chair. The argument unfolded with the terrifying momentum of something that had actually been building for years. Emma began crying almost immediately, her small shoulders trembling while Lily moved protectively closer beside her. Richard paced across the kitchen, every sentence sharper than the one before it. He accused Eva of making the girls emotionally dependent on her, of undermining him, of slowly positioning herself as the center of the household. None of it sounded fully rational even as he said it, but grief and humiliation had already taken control of him completely. Eva could have defended herself more aggressively. She could have reminded him about the nightmare she handled alone while he worked through midnight meetings. She could have mentioned the therapy appointments she secretly arranged for the girls after Caroline's death, because neither child was coping well emotionally. She could have listed every birthday, every school project, every breakdown she quietly helped carry while Richard buried himself inside business expansion after the funeral. But she didn't. Maybe because she understood he was unraveling. Maybe because people who spend years protecting children often become skilled at absorbing emotional damage silently. Instead, she simply said, "This isn't really about me." That sentence only made things worse. Richard interpreted her calmness as guilt. His breathing became uneven. His eyes looked glassy with exhaustion and anger. Then came the line he would later regret more than anything else he said that day. "You were hired to help this family," he told her coldly, "not replace me inside it." The words hit the room like shattered glass. Emma burst into louder tears instantly while Eva stood frozen beside the counter as though the accusation physically wounded her. Lily's reaction changed everything. She slowly stood from her chair and stared directly at her father with a level of disappointment no 11-year-old child should ever have to feel. There was no screaming in her voice, no tantrum, just heartbreak turning into clarity. "She never tried to replace you," Lily whispered. "You stopped showing up yourself." The silence afterward felt endless. Even Richard looked stunned hearing the sentence out loud. But pride is dangerous once anger pushes it too far. Instead of stopping, he pointed toward the hallway and told Eva to pack her things immediately. Emma cried so hard she could barely breathe properly while Eva knelt beside her trying to calm her even through her own tears. Lily remained standing between them and her father almost protectively. Richard kept insisting this decision was necessary, that boundaries had been crossed, that the family needed distance. But the more he spoke, the more emotionally disconnected he sounded from the reality unfolding directly in front of him. Finally, Lily said the sentence that would eventually spread across social media clips, reaction channels, and comment sections once the story became public months later. The sentence people still quote whenever discussing the Belmont family collapse. "If she leaves," Lily whispered softly, "we're leaving too." Richard stared at his daughter in disbelief. Emma clung tighter to Eva's arm, sobbing uncontrollably. And for one brief moment, the entire mansion seemed suspended between grief and catastrophe. Eva packed quietly. That was what haunted Richard later more than the argument itself. No screaming, no threats, no dramatic accusations, just heartbreaking silence. Emma followed her from room to room carrying one of Eva's scarves tightly against her chest while Lily refused to look at her father at all. Downstairs, staff members avoided eye contact entirely as the emotional weight inside the mansion became impossible to ignore. Outside, evening clouds darkened above the estate while the massive iron gates slowly opened near the driveway. Richard stood near the foyer convincing himself he was restoring order, even as every instinct deep inside him warned he had made a devastating mistake. Then Eva walked out carrying a single suitcase. Emma suddenly broke free and ran barefoot across the cold stone driveway after her screaming through tears. The image burned itself permanently into Richard Belmont's memory, his youngest daughter crying desperately while clinging to the woman he had just forced out of their lives. Eva knelt down one final time, wrapped her arms around Emma tightly, kissed the top of her head, and whispered something nobody else could hear. Then she stood, entered the waiting car, and disappeared beyond the mansion gates. Seconds later, the entire estate fell completely silent. The silence inside the Belmont mansion did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, room by room, like winter creeping through the walls of an abandoned house. On the first night after Eva Reyes left, Richard Belmont convinced himself the tension would ease by morning. Children get emotional, he told himself. Time would calm things down. Routines would return. But when breakfast came the next day, the kitchen felt almost unrecognizable. Emma barely touched her pancakes. Lily sat silently staring out the tall windows while rain slid down the glass in slow, crooked lines. Eva's favorite coffee mug still rested near the far side of the marble counter, exactly where she left it before the argument. One of the housekeepers quietly moved to wash it before stopping halfway, almost afraid to touch it. Even staff members could feel the emotional damage lingering inside the room. Richard attempted normal conversation twice during breakfast. Asked Lily about school. Asked Emma whether she finished her art project. Neither answer lasted more than a few words. The mansion was still beautiful, still expensive, still perfectly maintained, but emotionally it no longer felt alive. Over the next several days, Richard began discovering something nobody warns powerful men about when they lose the emotional center of their homes. Wealth cannot protect silence from becoming unbearable. During business meetings, he remained sharp enough to survive the growing financial pressure surrounding his company. He fought through investor calls, legal threats, and media speculation with the same controlled intensity that built his empire. But every evening, he returned to a house that no longer felt like his family lived inside it. The piano Caroline used to play remained closed in the music room, untouched for days. Emma stopped leaving crayons scattered across the dining table. Lily no longer lingered downstairs after dinner reading beside the fireplace. Instead, both girls retreated emotionally deeper into themselves. Sometimes Richard heard their bedroom doors close before he even entered the hallway. Other times he caught Lily guiding Emma upstairs the moment his voice echoed through the kitchen. It was not anger anymore. Anger at least still carries emotion. This felt colder. Withdrawal. The kind children develop after deciding someone no longer feels emotionally safe. Richard tried reconnecting the only ways he understood. He canceled meetings to attend one of Emma's school activities, but she barely looked toward the audience during her performance. He bought concert tickets for Lily's favorite singer, hoping the surprise might soften the tension between them. Lily thanked him politely without smiling once. At dinner, he attempted asking questions about their days the way Eva once encouraged him to, but conversations collapsed almost immediately into awkward silence. The hardest part was realizing how much emotional labor Eva had been quietly performing all along. She translated moods, smoothed difficult moments, filled empty spaces before they became painful. Without her presence, the emotional fractures inside the family became impossible to ignore. Richard noticed small things constantly now. The extra dining chair still slightly pulled away from the table because Emma kept expecting Eva to return. Half-finished crossword puzzles abandoned beside the breakfast nook where Eva used to sit helping Lily study vocabulary words. A blanket still folded carefully across the downstairs couch because Emma insisted nobody move it. The mansion had become a museum of emotional routines that suddenly stopped existing. At night, the silence became worse. Richard started wandering the hallways long after midnight, unable to sleep properly. Sometimes he paused outside the girls' bedrooms listening for movement before walking away again. Other nights he sat alone in the dark kitchen, staring at untouched dinner plates left beside the sink because nobody had eaten much. One evening, while passing the family room, he noticed something that unsettled him deeply. Emma sat alone on the carpet speaking softly toward an empty armchair near the fireplace. At first Richard thought she was talking to herself, but when he moved closer, he realized she was pretending Eva still sat there listening to her. And then Lily got mad at school today. Emma whispered quietly into the empty room while clutching one of Eva's scarves against her chest. But I think she's just sad. Richard froze in the hallway completely unnoticed. Emma continued talking for several minutes like someone answering back existed only she could still hear. Grief in children often reveals itself through imagination first, but standing there in silence, Richard felt something much heavier than guilt beginning to settle inside him. Fear. Real fear that the emotional damage inside his daughters might already be deeper than he understood. Lily handled the loss differently. She became quieter every day after Eva left, sharper too. One afternoon Richard entered the upstairs study searching for documents and found Lily sitting alone at the family computer scrolling through old photographs. For a brief second he thought she might finally be revisiting happier memories. Then he noticed what she was actually doing, deleting pictures, entire folders disappearing one after another, family vacations, holiday dinners, birthday celebrations. Richard stepped forward, instinctively asking what she was doing. Lily didn't even look up from the screen immediately. "Cleaning things up," she answered flatly. Richard told her to stop, confusion slowly turning into alarm as more photographs vanished permanently. Finally, Lily turned toward him, eyes red from crying she clearly tried hiding. "What's the point of pretending we're still a family?" she asked quietly. Richard had no answer ready. Because deep down, part of him understood exactly why she felt that way. The family photographs captured moments when Caroline was still alive, when Eva still held the emotional structure of the household together. Looking at them now probably felt painful rather than comforting. Lily shut the laptop without another word and walked past him out of the room, leaving Richard standing alone, surrounded by memories he suddenly realized he might lose completely. The housekeepers began noticing changes in Emma too. She started carrying Eva's scarf everywhere. During meals, she often glanced automatically toward the empty kitchen doorway, expecting Eva to appear holding snacks or reminding her to finish vegetables before dessert. One morning, a staff member discovered Emma asleep on the floor inside Eva's old guest room, curled beside the suitcase closet where several forgotten belongings still remained untouched. Richard heard about it later and stood silently outside the room for nearly a full minute before entering. Everything inside looked painfully ordinary. A half-used hand lotion bottle near the bathroom sink, books stacked neatly beside the bed, one hair tie still wrapped around the corner of a lamp. Richard slowly realized how completely Eva had woven herself into the emotional fabric of their lives. Not intentionally, not manipulatively, simply through presence, through consistency, through showing up every single day when grief made everything else unstable. And now that absence echoed through the mansion louder than any argument ever could. Meanwhile, the financial pressure surrounding Richard's company continued worsening publicly. News articles questioned his leadership decisions. Reporters waited outside corporate offices. Investors demanded reassurance during tense conference calls that stretched late into the night. Under normal circumstances, Richard would have thrown himself entirely into fixing the crisis. But his concentration had started breaking apart unexpectedly. During meetings, he caught himself remembering Emma running barefoot after Eva's car. During interviews, Lily's words replayed repeatedly in the back of his mind. "You stopped showing up yourself." The sentence followed him everywhere now, in elevators, during flights, sitting alone at his office desk long after midnight. For the first time since Caroline died, Richard began confronting an idea too painful to ignore. Maybe his daughters had not been emotionally overreacting after all. Maybe Eva had become essential because he emotionally abandoned parts of fatherhood long before he realized it himself. The breaking point came late one rainy evening nearly 2 weeks after Eva left. Richard had returned from Manhattan exhausted after spending hours fighting through another disastrous board meeting. The mansion was unusually quiet even by recent standards. As he passed the upstairs hallway, he noticed Emma's bedroom door slightly open with soft crying coming from inside. Instinctively, he stopped. Through the narrow opening, he saw Emma sitting on her bed hugging Eva's scarf tightly while Lily sat beside her trying unsuccessfully to comfort her. "I miss her too," Lily whispered gently. Emma shook her head hard through tears. Then came the sentence that completely shattered whatever emotional defenses Richard still had left. "I want my real family back." The words were small, broken, childlike, but they hit Richard harder than any financial scandal or business betrayal ever could. Because standing alone outside that bedroom, he suddenly understood something devastating. His daughters no longer associated family with him. They associated it with the feeling of safety Eva created around them after Caroline died. Richard barely slept that night. He wandered through the mansion in darkness, replaying Emma's voice repeatedly inside his head, while rain tapped softly against the windows. Around 2 in the morning, he entered the downstairs library searching for old financial records to distract himself with work. Instead, something else caught his attention entirely. Hidden beneath several books inside one of the lower drawers sat a small wooden box he had never seen before. At first he assumed it belonged to Caroline. But when he opened it, he froze immediately. Inside rested dozens of neatly folded handwritten letters tied together carefully with pale blue ribbon, some addressed to Eva, others written by Lily. Several carried dates going back nearly 2 years, and the moment Richard unfolded the first page and began reading, he realized there were entire parts of his daughter's emotional lives he knew absolutely nothing about. Richard Belmont read the first letter 3 times before the words fully settled inside him. His hands remained still against the desk, while rain continued tapping softly against the library windows behind him. The handwriting belonged to Caroline. Even after 3 years, he recognized it instantly. Smooth, careful, warm in a way that somehow made the paper itself feel alive again. The letter had been written only weeks before her death, during the final stage of the illness she spent months trying to hide from the girls. Most of the message discussed ordinary things at first: school schedules, Emma's fear of thunderstorms, Lily pretending to be brave whenever doctors visited the house. But near the bottom of the page, Caroline wrote something that caused Richard's chest to tighten painfully. "If the girls ever begin slipping away emotionally after I'm gone, trust Eva. She sees things people miss." Richard stared at the sentence for a long time without moving, because suddenly dozens of moments from the past 3 years began rearranging themselves inside his memory differently. Eva calming Emma after nightmares, Eva guiding difficult conversations at dinner, Eva always somehow knowing when Lily was quietly falling apart emotionally before anyone else noticed. None of it had been manipulation. Caroline herself had trusted Eva with the emotional survival of their daughters long before Richard even understood how much help they would eventually need. The deeper Richard went into the letters, the worse the guilt became. Some notes were from Caroline directly to Eva written during hospital treatments Richard barely remembered clearly, because he spent most of that period convincing himself his wife would somehow recover. In one letter, Caroline thanked Eva for promising never to let the girls feel emotionally abandoned after her death. Another apologized in advance for the burden grief would place on everyone inside the house. Richard's breathing slowed unevenly while reading because for the first time, he began realizing how much emotional devastation Eva had quietly absorbed alone while he buried himself inside work and denial. Caroline had understood something before anyone else. She understood Richard's instinct during pain would always be distance, structure, control, work, and she trusted Eva to protect the emotional spaces he might unknowingly leave empty afterward. The realization hit him almost violently. The woman he accused of overstepping boundaries had actually been carrying out promises made to his dying wife. Richard barely noticed the clock moving past 3 in the morning. One letter led to another, then another. Some were written by Lily during the hardest months after Caroline's funeral. Reading them felt almost invasive, but he could not stop once he started because every page exposed emotional truths he had completely missed while living inside the same house. In one letter, Lily thanked Eva for sitting outside her bedroom during panic attacks until sunrise because she was afraid everyone she loved would disappear while she slept. Another described how Emma stopped eating lunch properly at school after Caroline died, until Eva began secretly leaving handwritten notes inside her backpack every morning. Richard closed his eyes hard after reading that one because he suddenly remembered Emma showing unusual excitement over school lunches during that period, without ever understanding why. Small moments that once seemed insignificant now revealed entire emotional battles happening invisibly around him for years. He began reconstructing the history of his family, almost like a detective examining evidence from a life he thought he understood completely. Then came the letter that truly broke him. It was written by Eva herself, but never sent to anyone. Folded separately near the bottom of the box, the pages looked worn from being reopened repeatedly over time. Richard hesitated before reading it, almost sensing instinctively that whatever waited inside would permanently change how he saw everything afterward. Eva described the first night Emma cried herself sick, asking whether her mother chose heaven over staying with them. She described Lily standing silently outside Caroline's old bedroom at 2 in the morning, because she was afraid forgetting her mother's voice meant betraying her memory. But the part Richard could barely process emotionally involved himself. Eva wrote about watching him slowly disappear into work after the funeral because grief terrified him too much to face directly. She never criticized him cruelly. That somehow made it worse. Instead, she described him as a man trying to outrun pain, while his daughters quietly drowned behind him. Richard covered his eyes with one trembling hand after reading the sentence because deep down he knew it was true. The following days became emotionally unbearable. Richard started searching the mansion differently now. Not physically, emotionally. Every room suddenly contained hidden evidence of things he should have noticed years earlier. Inside kitchen drawers, he found old grocery lists where Eva reminded herself which foods Emma refused to eat during grief episodes. In the family room, he discovered notebooks filled with emotional exercises Lily completed during difficult periods after Caroline's death. One afternoon, he uncovered receipts from a child psychologist's office hidden between school forms inside Eva's desk drawer. At first, he assumed the appointments were temporary school counseling sessions. But when he checked the dates carefully, his stomach dropped. The therapy visits stretched across nearly 2 years. 2 years. Richard sat frozen at the desk staring at the paperwork while disbelief slowly turned into horror. Eva had secretly arranged professional grief therapy for both girls because their emotional condition had become more serious than anyone realized. And he never even knew. The discovery forced Richard to reconstruct entire periods of family life differently. Suddenly, Emma's gradual improvement after nightmares made sense. Lily's emotional maturity no longer seemed natural for her age. Eva had been managing trauma recovery almost entirely alone, while Richard focused on business expansion and financial stability. He tried convincing himself there must have been some misunderstanding. Maybe the girls only attended briefly. Maybe Caroline approved it before she died. But another envelope buried inside the wooden box erased those excuses immediately. Inside sat handwritten progress notes from the therapist addressed directly to Eva. The therapist thanked her repeatedly for being the consistent emotional presence, stabilizing the children after severe grief reactions. One note specifically mentioned concern over the father's increasing emotional absence due to work dependency following bereavement. Richard stopped reading halfway through because shame hit him so hard he physically stood from the chair, just to breathe properly again. What made everything even more painful was realizing Eva never once used any of this against him during the argument. She could have destroyed every accusation instantly. She could have exposed how much emotional labor she performed while he emotionally vanished from the household. She could have revealed the therapy appointments, the panic attacks, the letters, the nights she stayed awake protecting his daughters from grief he barely understood how to confront himself. Instead, she stayed calm while he humiliated her in front of the children. Richard replayed the kitchen argument constantly now, but every memory felt different after the letters. Her silence no longer looked suspicious. It looked protective. Even while being accused unfairly, Eva still prioritized shielding the girls from further emotional damage. That realization haunted him more than anything else. Meanwhile, the emotional distance between Richard and his daughters continued growing worse. Lily stopped speaking to him almost entirely after Eva left. Not even short answers anymore. Complete silence. If Richard entered a room, Lily quietly left it. During meals, she stared at her plate without acknowledging him once. Emma still cried openly, but Lily's grief hardened into something colder. Disappointment. Betrayal. One evening, Richard attempted apologizing for the argument indirectly, explaining he may have handled things badly. Lily looked at him for the first time in nearly 2 days, then asked one devastating question. "Do you even know what you destroyed?" Before he could answer, She stood up and walked upstairs without another word. Richard remained alone at the dinner table afterward, staring at the untouched extra chair where Eva always used to sit, helping Emma finish vegetables before dessert. For the first time since Caroline died, he truly understood how emotionally disconnected he had become from the people he loved most. The investigation into his own family consumed him quietly after that. Every memory became evidence. Every emotional moment replayed differently inside his mind. He remembered nights arriving home too late to notice Emma had been crying for hours beforehand. He remembered dismissing Lily's mood swings as normal teenage behavior, even though she was only 11. He remembered Eva gently encouraging family dinners, while he canceled repeatedly for meetings he barely recalled now. Piece by piece, Richard began understanding the terrifying truth. His daughters had not attached themselves to Eva because she manipulated them. They attached themselves to her because emotionally she stayed. She listened. She noticed. She protected them from grief while he tried protecting them financially from a world that no longer felt emotionally safe after Caroline died. The mansion itself even looked different to him now. Less luxurious, more haunted. Like a beautiful structure, quietly covering years of emotional neglect, nobody wanted to acknowledge openly. Then Richard discovered something else hidden between the letters that changed everything again. Folded carefully near the bottom of the box sat 2 train tickets purchased only 3 days earlier. One adult ticket, 2 children's tickets, destination, Boston. Attached was a handwritten note in Lily's careful handwriting. "If Dad sends you away, we're coming too." Richard Belmont did not sleep after discovering the train tickets. He remained alone inside the downstairs library long after sunrise, staring at the small pieces of paper spread across the desk beside Lily's handwritten note while the entire mansion stayed silent around him. One adult ticket, 2 children's tickets, purchased online only 3 days after Eva Reyes left the house. Destination Boston. Departure scheduled for the following Friday evening. Richard read Lily's message repeatedly until the words began feeling unreal in his hands. "If Dad sends you away, we're coming too." The sentence carried none of the emotional chaos he expected from children. No dramatic threats, no childish anger. That was what frightened him most. The note felt calm, planned, thought through carefully over time. Somewhere deep inside the pit forming in his stomach, Richard realized something terrifying. His daughters had not simply reacted emotionally after Eva left. They had already started preparing to leave him too. For the first time since Caroline died, Richard began understanding how little he actually knew about what happened emotionally inside his own home, while he buried himself inside work. Every discovery now opened another hidden layer beneath the family life he thought he understood. He returned upstairs quietly before the girls woke fully, carrying the letters and train tickets with him like evidence from an investigation he desperately wished was not real. Outside Emma's bedroom, he paused after hearing soft whispering through the door. At first he assumed the girls were discussing school. Then he heard Eva's name again. Richard remained perfectly still, listening unintentionally as Emma's small voice drifted through the silence. "Do you think she still has the blue scarf?" she asked quietly. Lily answered after a long pause. "Probably." Another silence followed before Emma whispered something that hit Richard harder than almost anything else he had heard since the firing. "Do you think Daddy would notice if we disappeared?" The sentence was innocent in delivery, almost curious. But standing alone in that hallway, Richard suddenly felt genuine panic rise through his chest for the first time in years. Lily's response came slowly, careful, protective in the way older siblings often become after trauma forces them emotionally beyond childhood too early. "He'd notice eventually," she whispered back. Richard physically closed his eyes after hearing the word eventually. Not immediately, not right away, eventually. That was how disconnected his daughters believed he had become from their emotional lives. Emma spoke again through tears she was clearly trying to hide. "I just want things to feel normal again." The girl realized Richard remained outside the door listening, while guilt settled heavier and heavier inside him with every sentence. The mansion around him suddenly felt enormous and unfamiliar. All the expensive artwork, the polished floors, the quiet luxury Caroline once loved decorating carefully for holidays and birthdays. None of it mattered standing there hearing his daughters quietly discuss disappearing from his life like children emotionally preparing for abandonment before it happened again. Over the next 2 days, Richard began watching the house differently, searching for signs he previously ignored. Once he started paying attention, the evidence appeared everywhere. Emma carried the same small pink backpack almost constantly now, even inside the house. Lily became unusually protective whenever anyone entered her bedroom unexpectedly. One afternoon while the girls were at school, Richard finally crossed a line he once would have considered unthinkable. He entered Lily's room searching for answers. At first everything looked ordinary enough. Schoolbooks stacked neatly beside the bed, Caroline's old framed photograph still resting on the nightstand. But hidden near the back of Lily's closet sat 2 packed backpacks carefully positioned beneath winter blankets. Richard slowly pulled them forward while a terrible feeling spread through him. Inside were folded clothes, snacks, toiletries, and envelopes containing cash. One bag even held Emma's inhaler wrapped carefully inside socks to protect it during travel. Richard sat motionless on the bedroom floor afterward staring at the backpacks, while realization crashed through him completely. His daughters were not fantasizing emotionally about leaving the mansion someday. They were actively preparing for it. The deeper he looked, the more frightening the planning became. Hidden between Lily's school notebooks was a printed train schedule with departure times highlighted in yellow marker. Another folded paper contained directions to Eva's apartment in Boston written carefully in Lily's handwriting after apparently researching the route online. Richard struggled to process the level of emotional desperation driving 2 grieving children towards secretly planning escape routes from their own home. Even worse, he began understanding why Lily never confronted him dramatically after Eva left. Lily had already emotionally stopped believing conversations with her father would change anything. Instead of fighting louder, she quietly began building an exit. That realization devastated Richard because he finally understood something many emotionally absent parents realize too late. Children rarely stop loving their parents suddenly. The distance happens gradually, one disappointment at a time, one broken emotional connection after another, until eventually silence replaces trust entirely. Then came the discovery that shattered whatever denial Richard still carried. Late Thursday evening, while searching through the downstairs office for more financial records connected to the growing business scandal, he found an old tablet device Emma occasionally used for games and homework. The battery was nearly dead. When he opened it, a messaging application remained active on the screen. At first, Richard intended to close it immediately. Then he saw Eva's name. His hands froze. The message thread stretched back days. Lily had secretly contacted Eva almost immediately after the firing, not angrily, not manipulatively. The messages felt heartbreaking in their simplicity. Emma keeps crying at night. Dad barely talks anymore. We miss you. Eva's responses remained careful every time. She repeatedly encouraged the girls to stay home, to communicate with their father, to avoid making emotional decisions while upset. But buried near the bottom of the conversation sat one message from Emma sent late at night only 2 days earlier. If we came to Boston, would you still want us there? Richard felt his heartbeat physically change reading the sentence. Eva's reply arrived hours later. Your father loves you both very much even when he struggles showing it. Richard stared at the words for a long time afterward because they revealed something almost unbearable emotionally. Even after being humiliated and forced out of the mansion unfairly, Eva still protected him in front of the girls. She never encouraged rebellion, never poisoned the daughters against him. In fact, several messages showed her actively trying to preserve the relationship between Richard and his children despite everything he had done. That realization destroyed the final piece of the narrative he once used to justify firing her. Eva had not manipulated the girls emotionally. She had been protecting them, protecting him too, in ways he never deserved. Meanwhile, the emotional atmosphere inside the mansion kept deteriorating quietly. Emma stopped asking when Eva was coming back because somewhere inside herself she already sensed the answer might hurt too much. Lily grew colder toward Richard every day. During meals, she barely looked at him anymore. Once, Richard attempted gently asking whether she wanted to talk about everything that happened. Lily answered without lifting her eyes from the plate. Talking didn't matter when you fired her. The sentence was calm, exhausted, much older than 11 years old. Richard noticed something else too. The girls had started emotionally functioning more like survival partners than children. Lily reminded Emma about medications, packed lunches herself when staff forgot small details Eva once handled automatically, checked train schedules secretly after homework. Grief and instability had quietly forced both daughters into emotional adulthood far too early. On Friday afternoon, Richard returned unexpectedly from Manhattan after canceling an investor meeting halfway through because he could no longer focus properly. The moment he entered the mansion, he sensed something wrong immediately. The downstairs felt too quiet. No television, no piano music, no movement upstairs. Then he noticed Emma's pink backpack missing from its usual spot beside the staircase. His chest tightened instantly. He moved upstairs, quickly calling both girls' names without response. Lily's bedroom closet stood slightly open. The hidden backpacks were gone. Richard's breathing turned uneven as genuine fear slammed into him fully for the first time. Not fear of financial collapse, not fear of scandal, fear of losing his daughters permanently. Then he saw it. A folded handwritten note resting carefully on the kitchen counter beside Eva's untouched coffee mug. Richard grabbed it with trembling hands while dread crawled through every part of him before he even unfolded the page. Because deep down, he already knew exactly what it would say. Richard Belmont unfolded the note with shaking hands while the silence inside the kitchen pressed against him like something alive. The handwriting belonged to Lily, careful, controlled, almost painfully mature for an 11-year-old child. "Emma keeps crying every night," the note began. "You don't hear it because you're always working or locking yourself in the office. She says the house doesn't feel like home anymore. I tried fixing things myself, but I can't do it alone." Richard's eyes moved lower across the page while his heartbeat pounded harder with every line. "We're going to Eva because she's the only person who still knows how to make Emma feel safe. I'm sorry." That was it. No anger, no dramatic accusations. Just quiet emotional surrender written by a little girl who no longer believed her father knew how to hold the family together. Richard looked around the kitchen wildly afterward as though the girls might somehow still appear from another room. But the mansion remained terrifyingly still. Then he saw the clock above the stove. The train to Boston was leaving in less than 40 minutes. For the first time in years, Richard completely lost control. Not publicly. Not in the polished corporate way wealthy men sometimes describe stress during interviews. This was real panic. Raw, immediate, human. He grabbed his coat so quickly it nearly fell from his hands and rushed out of the mansion without even notifying security where he was going. Rain hammered against the windshield during the drive toward Grand Central Terminal, while his mind replayed every moment from the past 3 years differently. Emma crying with Eva's scarf wrapped around her shoulders. Lily deleting family photographs alone inside her room. Caroline's letters warning him not to disappear emotionally after her death. Suddenly, every ignored conversation, every canceled dinner, every distracted answer became evidence in a case against himself. The terrifying realization growing inside him had nothing to do with losing authority anymore. It was much worse. His daughters had been grieving alone while he convinced himself financial success somehow counted as emotional presence. Traffic crawled through Manhattan under sheets of rain while Richard repeatedly checked the clock on the dashboard with growing desperation. Several times he tried calling Lily's phone, but every call went unanswered. He called Emma next even though she rarely remembered to charge her device properly. Nothing. His breathing became uneven again. The storm outside blurred neon lights across wet streets while memories kept attacking him faster and faster inside his head. Emma asking whether people she loved always left eventually. Lily standing silently beside Caroline's casket, trying not to cry because she thought being strong would help her father survive the funeral. Eva sitting alone in hospital waiting rooms holding both girls while Richard buried himself inside paperwork and medical logistics because emotions terrified him more than exhaustion ever could. For years, he blamed work for his emotional distance. But deep down, another truth had started surfacing now. Work had not only been responsibility, it had been hiding, a place where grief could be postponed indefinitely. By the time Richard reached the station, the storm had intensified. Rainwater soaked through his coat almost instantly as he pushed through crowded platforms searching frantically for the girls. Loudspeaker announcements echoed overhead while trains hissed against wet tracks beneath fluorescent lights. Every few seconds he thought he spotted Emma's pink backpack somewhere in the crowd before realizing it belonged to another child entirely. Panic changes perception that way. Time starts moving unevenly. Faces blur together. Richard checked departure boards repeatedly until he found the Boston train scheduled to leave in 9 minutes. Then he started running, past strangers, past security barriers, past families hugging goodbye beneath the storm-darkened terminal ceiling. The image of Emma running barefoot after Eva's car returned so violently inside his mind that he nearly stopped breathing altogether, because now he understood something horrifying. That moment outside the mansion had not simply been a child upset over a nanny leaving. Emma had been trying desperately to hold onto the last emotional stability left in her life. Richard searched every passenger line along the platform before finally spotting them near the far end beneath dim overhead lights. Lily stood beside 2 small backpacks gripping Emma's hand tightly, while Emma clutched Eva's scarf against her chest, exactly the way she had every night since the firing. Neither girl noticed Richard immediately. For several seconds he simply stared at them from across the crowded platform, while emotion crashed through him harder than anything he had experienced since Caroline died. They looked so small, so exhausted, not rebellious children running away dramatically, just 2 grieving daughters quietly trying to reach the only place that still felt emotionally safe. Richard started toward them slowly at first before Lily finally turned and saw him. Her expression changed instantly. Fear mixed with disappointment. Emma spun around next and froze completely beside her sister. The moment stretched painfully between them. Richard tried speaking, but nothing came out initially. Around them, passengers continued boarding while rain battered the station roof overhead. Finally, he managed to say Lily's name softly. Lily stepped slightly in front of Emma protectively without realizing she had done it. That movement alone nearly shattered him emotionally, because it revealed how deeply responsibility had settled onto her shoulders after Caroline died. Richard looked at the backpacks beside them, then back at his daughters. "Please," he said quietly, "just talk to me." Lily's eyes filled with tears immediately, but her voice remained controlled. "You fired the only person who stayed with us after Mom died." Richard opened his mouth to defend himself instinctively before stopping halfway, because for the first time he realized defending himself no longer mattered. The truth standing in front of him was too overwhelming now. His daughters were not leaving because they hated him. They were leaving because emotionally, they no longer trusted him to protect their hearts. Then Emma spoke, small voice, trembling. "Did we do something wrong?" The question destroyed whatever emotional control Richard still carried, because suddenly he understood how children internalize loss. Emma genuinely believed people leaving might somehow be her fault. Caroline disappeared. Eva disappeared. And somewhere inside herself she had started wondering whether love always ended with abandonment eventually. Richard dropped to his knees right there on the crowded station platform, while rainwater dripped from his coat sleeves onto the concrete floor beneath him. He covered his face briefly with one hand, trying unsuccessfully to steady his breathing. For years, he survived business wars, public scandals, hostile negotiations, and financial disasters without ever fully breaking emotionally. But this moment shattered him completely, not because he was losing control of the family. Not because the girls planned to leave the mansion, but because he finally saw the emotional reality hidden underneath everything. His daughters had been carrying unbearable grief mostly alone, while he disappeared deeper and deeper into work trying to outrun his own pain. People passing nearby slowed slightly, noticing the scene unfolding under the station lights, but Richard barely registered them anymore. His entire world had narrowed to the two girls standing in front of him. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said finally, voice breaking hard enough that Emma immediately started crying too. "None of this was your fault." Lily's expression softened for the first time in weeks, though tears still streamed down her face quietly. Richard looked between both daughters with the devastation of a man finally confronting years of emotional absence all at once. "I thought if I kept everything stable financially." He stopped mid-sentence because even saying the words aloud suddenly sounded hollow, meaningless. Emma moved closer first, uncertain and emotional, while Lily remained frozen beside the backpacks watching him carefully. Richard lowered his head completely then, unable to stop the grief he had spent 3 years suppressing from finally collapsing out of him in public. Not polished sadness, not controlled mourning, real grief. The kind that leaves people breathless because they realize too late how many moments they already lost forever. And in the middle of that storm-covered station, while trains thundered through the darkness behind them, Richard Belmont finally understood something Eva Reyes had known from the beginning. His daughters never needed a perfect father. They needed a present one. The devastating part was realizing Eva never hated him for failing them emotionally. Hidden among the messages on Emma's tablet had been another conversation Richard could not stop replaying afterward. One where Lily asked Eva directly whether she was angry at their father. Eva answered simply, "No, I think your dad is hurting so badly he forgot other people are hurting too." That sentence followed Richard now like an echo through every painful memory crashing inside him. Because even after everything he accused her of, Eva still saw him not as a monster, but as a drowning man who no longer realized his children were drowning beside him too. The train to Boston left the station that night without Lily and Emma Belmont on it. But the emotional damage inside the family did not suddenly disappear because Richard Belmont finally broke down in public. Real healing almost never arrives dramatically. It moves slower than people expect. More awkwardly, too. After nearly 20 minutes sitting together beneath the storm-darkened station lights, Richard convinced the girls to leave with him, but not to return home immediately. The mansion no longer felt emotionally safe for any of them. Even Richard understood that now. So instead of driving back to Connecticut through the rain, he took them somewhere much smaller. A quiet 24-hour diner several blocks from the station, where exhausted travelers sat drinking coffee beneath flickering lights, while old country music played softly from ceiling speakers nobody paid attention to anymore. It was the kind of place Richard Belmont would have ignored completely before Caroline died. Too ordinary, too simple. But that night, surrounded by stained menus and half-empty coffee cups, the billionaire who once controlled boardrooms full of investors looked more emotionally exposed than he ever had inside his entire luxury empire. Emma sat beside him quietly in the booth, still clutching Eva's scarf, while Lily remained across from him, emotionally guarded despite the tears she had cried earlier at the station. For several minutes none of them spoke much. Rain slid slowly down the diner windows, while waitresses moved through the room refilling coffee mugs for truck drivers and late-night workers. Richard watched his daughters carefully now in ways he realized he should have years earlier. Emma looked exhausted. Lily looked older than 11. Grief had reshaped both girls slowly while he kept convincing himself time alone would heal them naturally. Finally, Richard spoke first, not defensively, not like a father trying to regain authority, just honestly. "I failed both of you," he admitted quietly. Lily's expression tightened slightly because children who experience emotional disappointment repeatedly often stop trusting apologies immediately. Richard noticed that too. "I thought providing everything financially meant I was protecting this family," he continued. "But I stopped paying attention to what was happening emotionally right in front of me." Neither girl answered immediately. Somewhere near the kitchen, plates clattered softly against each other while thunder rolled outside above the city. Then Emma asked the question both daughters had clearly been carrying since Eva left the mansion. "Can we see her?" Richard lowered his eyes briefly toward the coffee growing cold in front of him before nodding slowly. "Yes," he answered, "if she wants to see me too." The wording mattered. For the first time, Richard understood reconciliation could not be demanded simply because he regretted his behavior now. Eva Reyes had every reason to refuse him entirely after the humiliation and accusations he forced onto her inside that kitchen. Yet even knowing that possibility terrified him emotionally, he also understood something equally important. The girls needed closure, real closure, not another emotional disappearance. So just before sunrise, after several unanswered calls and one painfully long drive through rain-covered streets outside Boston, Richard finally parked outside a modest brick apartment building near the edge of a quiet neighborhood Eva moved into temporarily after leaving the Belmont mansion. No security gates, no marble driveways, no towering chandeliers behind glass windows. Just ordinary apartments stacked closely together beneath dim streetlights while rainwater dripped steadily from rusted fire escapes overhead. Richard remained inside the car nearly a full minute before stepping out. Fear moved through him differently now. Not fear of losing reputation or business control. Fear of facing the emotional consequences of what he had done to someone who genuinely cared for his family. Emma spotted Eva first through the apartment window before anyone knocked. Within seconds, the front door opened abruptly, and Eva appeared barefoot wearing an oversized gray sweater, frozen completely at the sight of the girls standing outside in the rain beside Richard. Emma ran toward her instantly, this time not chasing after someone leaving, but throwing her arms around the woman she thought she might never see again. Eva held her tightly almost on instinct, while emotion crossed her face so quickly she could barely hide it. Lily followed next, quieter but equally emotional, and for several seconds Richard simply stood there watching the reunion from the sidewalk, unable to speak at all. Because seeing the girls finally breathe easier again shattered the last illusion he once carried about how emotionally important Eva had become inside their lives. Eva eventually looked up at Richard standing near the curb beneath the rain. The silence between them stretched painfully. She looked exhausted too, not angry exactly, just emotionally worn down by everything that happened. Richard stepped forward slowly while Emma remained holding Eva's hand tightly like she feared letting go might somehow make her disappear again. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Richard finally said the words he should have said long before things collapsed. "I was wrong." No excuses followed. No explanations about stress or grief or financial pressure, just truth. "I accused you of things that were never true. I humiliated you in front of the girls, and instead of seeing how much pain they were in, I blamed the one person trying to help them survive it." Eva's eyes filled slowly, but she remained quiet. Richard continued anyway because this apology was no longer about protecting his pride. "You carried this family emotionally while I disappeared into work and grief. Caroline trusted you with the girls because she understood something about me I didn't want to admit." His voice nearly broke again before he finished the sentence. "I thought controlling everything would stop me from losing more people, but all I did was push my daughters away." Eva looked down briefly at Emma before finally answering. "They missed their father," she said softly, "more than anything." Richard nodded immediately because hearing the truth hurt less now than denying it. They stood there outside the apartment building for a long time while rain softened around them gradually. No dramatic forgiveness arrived. No instant emotional resolution. Eva did not suddenly smile and pretend the damage never happened. That would have felt dishonest after everything the girls endured. Instead, the moment felt fragile, careful, like people standing inside the ruins of something broken trying to decide whether rebuilding was emotionally possible at all. Eventually, Eva invited them upstairs for coffee and dry clothes because Emma was shivering from the cold. The apartment itself looked modest but warm. Children's drawings Lily and Emma apparently mailed her already sat taped carefully against the refrigerator door. One corner held stacks of grief therapy books Richard recognized instantly from the paperwork hidden inside the library box. Every detail inside the apartment quietly confirmed what the letters already revealed. Eva never stopped caring about the girls after leaving. She simply believed staying away might protect them from more conflict. Hours passed slowly inside the apartment while dawn crept across the windows. Emma eventually fell asleep beside Eva on the couch, clutching the same scarf she carried through weeks of heartbreak inside the mansion. Lily stayed quieter, watching both adults carefully as though emotionally testing whether trust could exist between them again. Richard answered difficult questions honestly for the first time in years. About Caroline, about grief, about why he hid inside work after the funeral instead of facing what happened emotionally to the family. At one point, Lily asked something so direct the room itself seemed to pause afterward. "Were you ever going to notice how unhappy we were without all this happening?" Richard looked at his oldest daughter for a long time before answering because he refused to lie anymore. "Probably not soon enough," he admitted quietly. Lily lowered her eyes afterward, tears returning instantly despite how hard she tried hiding them. Sometimes honesty hurts more because it sounds unmistakably real. The emotional breakthrough finally arrived near sunrise. Emma stirred awake slowly beneath the blanket Eva wrapped around her shoulders and looked between everyone in the room with exhausted confusion. Richard sat across from her silently while Eva remained beside her on the couch. For the first time since Caroline's death, the atmosphere around all four of them felt emotionally open instead of guarded. Fragile, but open. Emma rubbed her eyes carefully, then asked the question that stopped every conversation entirely. "Does this mean we can be a family again?" Nobody answered immediately. Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows while the silence settled around them. Richard looked toward Eva. Eva looked toward the girls. And in that quiet little apartment far away from the cold luxury of the Belmont mansion, the weight of grief, regret, forgiveness, and love hung suspended between them without a single word needing to break it right away. The Belmont mansion looked different after that night in Boston. Not physically. The marble floors still reflected morning sunlight across the hallways. The chandeliers still glowed softly above the staircase every evening. The gardens remained perfectly maintained beyond the tall windows Caroline once loved opening during spring mornings. But emotionally, the house no longer carried the same cold silence that had settled over it after Eva Reyes left. Healing did not arrive suddenly or perfectly. There were no dramatic speeches transforming the family overnight. Trust rebuilt itself slowly through ordinary moments people outside the house probably would never notice. Richard Belmont began coming downstairs for breakfast without his phone in his hand. Family dinners stopped feeling like formal obligations and slowly became conversations again. Emma laughed more often. Lily remained cautious for a long time, but the sharp emotional distance in her eyes gradually softened week by week. Even the staff noticed the difference. The mansion still held grief inside it because losing Caroline would always leave an absence no amount of healing could completely erase. But now, the family finally started grieving together instead of separately. Eva did not immediately move back into the mansion after the reunion. That mattered. Real emotional recovery rarely follows clean cinematic timelines. For several weeks, she continued living in the Boston apartment while helping the girls transition back emotionally toward stability. Richard respected that boundary completely because he finally understood trust could not be demanded simply because someone apologized sincerely. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his relationship with his daughters first. He attended therapy sessions alongside them, actual sessions, sitting inside quiet offices listening to difficult truths he once spent years avoiding. Sometimes Emma cried discussing Caroline openly for the first time without fear of upsetting her father emotionally. Sometimes Lily expressed anger so honestly the room itself seemed heavier afterward. Richard listened anyway. That became the real turning point. Not wealth, not gifts, Not promises, presence. He stayed in uncomfortable conversations instead of escaping into work every time grief surfaced. Slowly, his daughters began noticing that change too. The piano in the music room eventually opened again. That happened nearly 3 months later during a rainy Sunday afternoon when Emma asked Eva to teach her one of Caroline's favorite songs. Richard stood quietly near the doorway listening while Lily rolled her eyes pretending not to enjoy the moment even though she secretly smiled halfway through the lesson. It was a small scene, ordinary by most standards, but for the Belmont family, moments like that carried enormous emotional weight now because they represented something grief had almost destroyed completely. Connection. The house no longer felt emotionally abandoned. It felt quieter than before Caroline died, yes, more fragile too, but also more honest. Richard stopped pretending work could replace emotional presence. The girls stopped carrying grief alone in silence. Eva stopped trying to protect everyone else while ignoring her own exhaustion completely. They became something different than the perfect, wealthy family outsiders once imagined. More human, more broken, but also more real. One evening near Christmas, Richard found Emma asleep downstairs on the living room couch with her head resting against Eva's shoulder, while Lily quietly finished homework beside the fireplace. Snow drifted slowly outside the mansion windows and soft piano music played from another room somewhere deeper inside the house. Richard stood there longer than necessary, simply watching the scene, because moments like this once felt impossible after everything collapsed. Eva looked up first, and for the first time since the firing, there was no guarded tension between them anymore. Just understanding, shared exhaustion, shared healing. Richard crossed the room quietly, then sat beside his daughters while Emma continued sleeping peacefully against Eva's side without fear someone she loved would disappear by morning. Months earlier, that same child asked whether her father would even notice if she vanished. Now she fell asleep safely in a room full of people emotionally present enough to notice every small thing about her again. That difference mattered more than the mansion, the business empire, or any financial success Richard spent years chasing after Caroline's death. The company scandal eventually faded too. Reporters moved on. Investors stabilized. Richard recovered financially much faster than he recovered emotionally. In interviews afterward, people noticed subtle changes in him without fully understanding why. He declined certain expansions, canceled unnecessary travel, started leaving meetings earlier to return home for dinner. Financial magazines described the shift as a billionaire reevaluating priorities after personal hardship. But the truth ran much deeper than that. Richard Belmont had finally learned something many fathers discover too late. Children do not remember the size of houses nearly as much as they remember emotional absence inside them. And grief unattended does not disappear quietly over time. It spreads. Through silence. Through distance. Through conversations families avoid because pain feels easier to survive separately. Until eventually, someone inside the house begins carrying everyone else emotionally, without anyone fully noticing the weight crushing them slowly. Years later, Lily would describe Eva Reyes not as the family nanny, but as the person who taught us surviving grief and surviving alone are two different things. That sentence explained almost everything, because in the end, this was never really a story about wealth or scandal or a billionaire losing control. It was a story about emotional neglect disguised as strength, about a father mistaking financial protection for emotional presence, about two daughters quietly drowning in grief while the adults around them struggled to face their own pain honestly. And perhaps most importantly, it became a story about the kind of people society often overlooks entirely. The quiet caregivers, the patient listeners, the ones standing in kitchens before sunrise making pancakes while carrying entire families emotionally on exhausted shoulders nobody properly thanks until they disappear. Sometimes grief does not destroy families loudly. Sometimes it happens softly, through unanswered questions, through missed dinners, through children learning not to expect emotional attention because disappointment hurts less when expectations disappear first. Richard Belmont nearly lost his daughters not because he stopped loving them, but because he stopped understanding how love needs to be felt consistently to survive inside grieving homes. Eva understood that instinctively. Caroline understood it before she died, and eventually, painfully, Richard learned it too. Sometimes the people holding a family together aren't the loudest voices in the house. Sometimes they're the quiet ones carrying everyone else's pain. Do you think Richard deserved forgiveness? Would you have left after what he said to Eva? Have you ever realized someone's value too late? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below because stories like this often hit people more personally than they expect. And if this story hit close to home, subscribe for more emotional stories that remind us what really matters when pride finally goes quiet.